This. You're dragged through the cobblestone streets of a medieval town, your wrists bound so tightly that the rope cuts into your flesh. The crowd follows behind you, hurling insults and rotten vegetables, their faces twisted with righteous fury. But as terrifying as this moment is, you have no idea that the real horror hasn't even begun. Because once those heavy wooden doors slam shut behind you, once you're alone with your captors in that stone chamber beneath the earth, you'll discover something that will chill you to your very core. In medieval times, there was one rule that governed every torture session, one commandment that was never broken. You were absolutely forbidden from screaming. Today we're going to descend into the darkest corners of medieval justice, where silence wasn't golden, it was mandatory. Where the absence of your voice became the most terrifying sound of all. This isn't just about pain. It's about a psychological warfare so sophisticated, so brutally effective, that it could break a human mind before the torturer ever laid a finger on their victim. The year is 1348, and Europe is drowning in plague, superstition, and religious fervor. The Catholic Church holds absolute power, and anyone accused of heresy, witchcraft, or blasphemy faces a fate worse than death. But here's what most people don't understand about medieval torture. It wasn't random violence. It was a carefully orchestrated science, designed not just to extract confessions, but to save souls. At least, that's what they told themselves. Deep beneath monasteries, castles, and town halls, torture chambers waited in perpetual darkness. These weren't the Hollywood dungeons you might imagine. They were methodically designed spaces, often blessed by priests before use. The stone walls were thick enough to muffle any sound that might escape, and the floors were sloped toward drains that had seen far too much use. The air hung heavy with the stench of fear, sweat, and something else, something metallic that never quite went away. But here's where the true horror begins. Before any physical torture commenced, victims were subjected to what medieval torturers called the showing. They were led through the chamber, past each instrument of pain, while the torturer calmly explained what each device would do to their body. The brazen bull, heated until the metal glowed red hot. The rack, designed to slowly pull joints from their sockets. The pear of anguish, inserted into body cavities and then expanded until it tore flesh from within. And during this entire horrific tour, there was one rule that was made crystal clear. Any scream, any cry for help, any vocal expression of pain would result in immediate and exponentially worse punishment. The torturer would lean in close, their breath hot against the victim's ear, and whisper the words that countless souls heard in their final coherent moments. Your silence is your only mercy. Why this rule? Why was screaming forbidden in the very place where screaming should have been expected, even justified? The answer lies in medieval Christian theology and the twisted logic of those who believed they were doing God's work. According to church doctrine, screaming during torture was considered a sign of unrepentance, a rejection of divine judgment. The church taught that true penitents would accept their suffering in silence, just as Christ had remained largely silent during his crucifixion. But there was another, more sinister reason. Medieval torturers understood something about human psychology that modern interrogators still study today. Screaming provided emotional release. It was a way for the mind to cope with unbearable pain. By forbidding screams, torturers forced their victims to internalize every moment of agony, to let it echo and multiply within their own minds until the psychological torture became far worse than the physical. The enforcement of this silence was as brutal as it was creative. Many torture chambers employed what they called the silence keeper, a specially designed gag that wasn't just meant to muffle sound, but to cause additional pain if the victim attempted to cry out. Some were fitted with internal spikes that would pierce the tongue and roof of the mouth. Others were designed to fill the mouth completely, forcing victims to breathe through their nose while experiencing excruciating pain. For those who broke the rule of silence, the consequences were immediate and devastating. A single scream might result in the addition of molten lead poured into the ears, not enough to kill, but enough to cause permanent deafness and unimaginable pain. 2 screams might mean the loss of fingers, removed one joint at a time with specially designed bone shears. 3 screams, and the torturer would often employ what they called the final mercy, a procedure so horrific that most victims would beg for death long before it was completed. The iron chair was one of the most feared instruments specifically because of how it interacted with the silence rule. Victims would be strapped to a chair made entirely of metal, then a fire would be lit beneath it. As the metal slowly heated, the victim's flesh would begin to sizzle and burn, but they had to endure it in complete silence. The smell of burning flesh would fill the chamber, the victim's own skin becoming their torture. But even the slightest whimper would result in the fire being stoked higher and additional restraints being added to prevent any movement that might provide even minimal relief. Then there was the Judas cradle, perhaps the most psychologically devastating device ever created. Victims would be positioned above a pyramid-shaped wooden point and slowly lowered onto it, the point entering body cavities and gradually tearing upward. The entire process could take hours, sometimes days, and victims were expected to maintain absolute silence throughout. Many would bite through their own tongues rather than risk making a sound, leading to a secondary form of torture as they slowly bled internally while still impaled. The scavenger's daughter worked differently, but with the same silence requirement. This device compressed the human body into an impossibly small space, forcing knees into the chest, arms around the legs, until bones began to crack and organs were crushed. Victims would feel their ribs snapping one by one, their spine compressing, their lungs struggling for air in the decreasing space. But any vocalization would result in the device being tightened further, accelerating the process toward death. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the silence rule was how it affected the torturers themselves. Many medieval accounts describe how the enforced quiet of torture sessions created an almost ritualistic atmosphere. Without screams to break the concentration, torturers could focus entirely on their victim's face, watching for the subtlest signs of breaking. They learned to read micro-expressions, to detect the exact moment when hope died in someone's eyes, to identify the precise instant when a person's mind began to fracture. This silence also served a practical purpose that reveals the true calculated nature of medieval torture. Screams could be heard through stone walls by other prisoners, creating panic and potentially inspiring desperate escape attempts or coordinated resistance. But silence created something far more terrifying: uncertainty. Prisoners in nearby cells would strain their ears for any sound, any indication of what was happening to their fellow captives. But they would hear nothing except the occasional scrape of metal on stone or the soft whisper of the torturer's voice giving instructions. The psychological impact on victims was devastating beyond measure. Humans are social creatures, and crying out in pain is one of our most basic instincts, a way of seeking help and comfort even in hopeless situations. By removing this outlet, medieval torturers created a form of psychological isolation that was often more unbearable than the physical pain itself. Victims would often report, in their final confessions, that the silence was what broke them, not the torture devices. Many victims developed what we might now recognize as dissociative disorders, their minds fragmenting under the dual assault of physical pain and enforced isolation. Unable to scream, unable to cry for help, unable to express their agony in any vocal way, many would retreat entirely into their own minds, emerging only to give whatever confession their torturers demanded. The most horrifying accounts come from the records of the Spanish Inquisition, where the silence rule reached its most refined and brutal implementation. Inquisitors developed elaborate theological justifications for every aspect of their torture methods, including detailed explanations for why screaming was not only forbidden, but actually considered a form of blasphemy that would damn the victim's soul for eternity. They created what they called silent confessions, where victims would be tortured until they lost the ability to speak altogether, their vocal cords damaged by suppressed screams, their throats torn by swallowed blood from bitten tongues. These victims would then be forced to write their confessions in their own blood, using fingers that had been systematically broken to ensure that even the act of writing was an additional form of torture. As you sit in your comfortable modern world, it's almost impossible to truly comprehend the level of calculated cruelty that the silence rule represented. This wasn't random violence or passionate anger. This was systematic psychological warfare designed to destroy the human spirit as efficiently as possible. The torturers kept detailed records, noting which combinations of physical pain and enforced silence were most effective at breaking different types of people. They discovered that strong-willed individuals often broke faster under the silence rule than weaker personalities, because their natural inclination to fight back was completely thwarted by their inability to vocalize their resistance. They learned that religious individuals often suffered more acutely because their faith taught them that crying out to God in times of trouble was not only acceptable but encouraged, yet here they were forbidden from doing so under pain of even worse torture. The silence rule created a unique form of trauma that followed survivors for the rest of their lives. Those few who survived torture sessions reported that they never fully recovered their voices, not because of physical damage, but because they had been so thoroughly conditioned to associate any vocalization with unbearable pain. Many became completely mute, living out their remaining years in a silence that had been literally tortured into them. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this history is how the silence rule reveals the true sophistication of medieval torture. This wasn't the work of sadistic monsters acting on impulse. These were educated, often highly religious individuals who had developed systematic methods of human destruction based on careful observation and theological study. They understood human psychology well enough to identify and exploit our most fundamental coping mechanisms. The legacy of the silence rule extended far beyond individual torture sessions. It created a culture of fear so pervasive that many people would confess to crimes they never committed rather than risk being subjected to the enforced silence of the torture chamber. The mere threat of being unable to scream was often enough to break people before any physical torture began. In the end, the medieval torture chamber's greatest weapon wasn't any of its horrific devices. It was the silence itself, that crushing, suffocating quiet that turned each victim's mind into their own private hell. The silence that transformed natural human responses into additional sources of pain. The silence that made each person's internal voice the only witness to their suffering, and then slowly drove that voice insane. Today, when you find yourself alone in the quiet of night, remember this. In medieval times, silence wasn't peace. It wasn't tranquility or rest. Silence was the most feared sound of all, because it meant that somewhere, in some stone chamber beneath the earth, someone was experiencing pain so terrible that even their screams had been stolen from them. And in that stolen silence, humanity revealed just how deep its capacity for calculated cruelty could go. The next time you raise your voice in anger, cry out in pain, or simply laugh with friends, remember how precious that sound truly is. Because there was a time in human history when the simple act of making a sound could mean the difference between surviving torture and experiencing something infinitely worse, the complete destruction of everything that made you human, one silent moment at a time.